So it is 1 o'clock, and we will go ahead and get started in order to stay on schedule. Thank you, everybody that was able to join for today. We are excited about the Industry 2020 solicitation. Today, I'll be walking through these slides. My name is James Shuri. I'm the Deputy Director and Chief Innovation Officer for TRISH, the Translational Research Institute for Space Health. I lead the industry program. We also have several members of the TRISH team involved today. So we have Kristen Fobb, who is our science lead, and we have Catherine, who is our operations lead and program manager. We also have Zelia, who's our support from the NRES group. And we also have Rachel, who is our communications lead, and Andy, who is our technology operations lead. So while I'll be walking through everything, we have a strong representation from TRISH. We are very much a team, and we'll be fielding questions later. So the focus for the webinar today and the solicitation is technologies that address cognitive and behavioral decrements, and we'll walk into that a little bit more here shortly. I'd ask any questions to go through the Q&A portal, and we'll work into those later. So to begin with, this is what we're hoping to cover. So the primary objective is to share the solicitation details, to work through things like the criteria, proposal requirements, to work through frequently asked questions, to field some questions, to explain kind of what we're hoping here at the Translational Research Institute for Space Health to get out of this solicitation and the funds that we are awarding to the applicants. So we'll walk through the risks, the areas of interest, the timeline, details, frequently asked questions, and then wrap up. So first and foremost, the Translational Research Institute for Space Health is tasked by NASA's Human Research Program to source and seed the best emerging health technologies and knowledge to support NASA's deep space exploration. So specifically, this is looking into supporting health and human performance for everything past low Earth orbit. This includes the Artemis and lunar efforts, as well as the expected missions to the Mars system outlined below. And so we are looking more than 2 to 3 to something like 15 years out. Very forward-looking in our solicitations, not only trying to ask the right questions, but also seeking very good problem solvers and technologies that help NASA and the Human Research Program reach its goals. So as an example of what NASA's Human Research Program looks for regarding health and human performance, the hostile environment of spaceflight is well documented on NASA's website and in their red risks. This involves radiation and a number of things that pertain to this, involving things like isolation, closed environments, altered gravity. We have a wide variety of risks associated with things like bone and muscle loss and exposure to the environment that is expected to be in deep space, which would be past the Van Allen belts. And the deliverables we're hoping to get out of the funding that TRISH releases to the public would be technologies, countermeasures, preventions, treatments, things that help mitigate risks and gaps. So briefly, space care, we think, is in essence an edge case for future care, but there are differences. So for instance, we're not looking for things that would be pre-screened out of an astronaut community, such as diabetes or some of the other things that may apply to a very large base that's reimbursable in North America. We're looking at specific differences in space care, but you'll see that actually they are still people. So it is still bone, it is still skeletal muscle, it is still neurosensory, it is still psychosocial. So they still deal with all of the same things that we do in just different ways. So TRISH is focused on 2 different ends of this technology readiness level chart. So you have this early stage, this proof of concept section, which is high risk. It is the TRL level 1 through 3. This is addressed more in things like our radiation solicitation and in our BRAS proposals. These are potentially academic or potentially early stage, and they're meant to help source and seed that early idea that can grow with time and maybe a longer timeline. The Trish Industry Program is focused on the higher TRL level projects. So these are things that are past prototype. They're with forward-looking R&D. So we're again expecting to help de-risk things that are on a path to market, but potentially further out, and potentially then can be folded into NASA's validation system, which includes things like analogs. And Trish would be able to support the translation of anything that we funded into NASA's uptake. And that's into operations. So typically things that are in the TRL level 6, 7, and 8 are things that are in the possibility of being digested by NASA. And we would help to support that. So in this particular solicitation, Trish is seeking novel and out-of-the-box approaches to cognitive and behavioral decrements. So again, focusing on what would be game-changing or what would change the discussion, things that are forward-looking, things that involve monitoring, unintrusive methods, anything that involves diagnosis that may be a new mechanism instead of something off the shelf, and interventions. We're specifically interested in things like countermeasures, things that not only identify a problem, but give us potential solutions that allow an astronaut to manage their own care in short order in an environment that might have access to low resources, low data, low power, small volume, small mass, things that have constraints, and getting things that can be miniaturized or improved to a point to where they can involve less expert overhead and more use in a tight environment would be ideal. So why would we focus on this now? The short answer is in the last couple of years, there has been a historically large amount of focus in this area. And some of that is just that things are getting a lot more visibility. Part of it is that there's a lot of investment into this space. And so there are more technologies that are in development, and it seems like a ripe time for our funding to help move some of these technologies into use. Because a lot of the things that astronauts deal with, a lot of humanity is dealing with right now. And an evidence of that is obviously the COVID situation. So you've got a number of people right now that are dealing with some aspects of isolation. And Scott Kelly released a New York Times article on how he dealt with isolation during the 1 year he was on the International Space Station. These are the things that we've been looking into for a while, but now they are really radically applicable across a lot of people, which makes for an interesting time for these technologies to get traction. Some of the things that we are hoping to see out of the solicitation. We specifically wrote this solicitation as a catch-all structure, and I thank Gary Strangman from our team in order to plan that and to put that together. The plan is, while we've laid these out as things that we're interested in, we're also interested in things that we don't know to ask for. So if there is something that applies to this environment, including cognitive and behavioral decrements, then we absolutely want to hear them, and we may not know to look for them. So some of the things that we're hoping to see, we're always looking for unobtrusive monitoring. So if there is a way that we can understand without slapping things on astronauts, they simply don't like that. Anything that can be passively monitored is ideal. Closed loop approaches, and these are basically things that involve countermeasures. So can we not only identify a problem, but can we also have solutions? Stress and anxiety interventions. So these are, again, things that are readily apparent across the country right now with a tremendous number of people dealing with stress and anxiety involving isolation. These also would apply to things like low resource environments or third world environments where you may not have an entire healthcare system. Some of the constraints we expect in the trip to Mars, which would be a 2.5-year trip to Mars, will involve very difficult data exchanges. And so it won't be possible to just tie in an expert for psychological services. It has to be more of a system. To that end, asynchronous communications will involve some aspect of lag. And so the conversational AI or some of the other work that are being done in a variety of ways that address how we're interacting with systems and how we're interacting with each other. When you have something like a 2 or 3 or 5 hour delay, can a system in essence help fill the gap? On brain-computer interfaces, we're starting to get a little further forward. These are things that are being explored but are not necessarily at market. And so, you know, there's direct and indirect mechanisms there, and so we were interested in what would be the best ways forward. And then improved health span or cognitive longevity. So the way it was described to me is the astronauts, to a certain extent, experience the effects of aging differently in space, and they are dealing with a lot of the same effects of longevity and altered aging. And so it's an interesting area where, if anything that can help treat some of that aspect or improve some of that aspect, also might obviously have a very large market on Earth. And so again, I'll reiterate, these are the things that we think are in the space that are cutting edge. We are actively encouraging anyone that has something that may even be out of this to consider submitting. We would like to see what you have in mind as well. So these are some of the examples of things that we know are applicable. Home-based systems or driver management systems, something where your environment interacts directly with you, measuring some aspect of your output as a human. This would allow for some amount of management, ideally, either from a vehicle or from a home, that would also apply to space. So we're going to have a vehicle. We're going to have 4 astronauts, 4 to 6 maybe, and the more that the system can do to help those astronauts, the better. On AI-driven speech analytics software. So this is, again, some of that asynchronous communication. Some of that may involve biomarkers. So it's not just the communication, but what can be measured also. So we're actively trying to figure out how we can assess when an astronaut may not be performing at their best, and then alert them so that they can potentially adjust. Complex algorithm-based platform software. So this isn't just an example of how different things can work together. So can you measure things like facial output or eye tracking or voice, but do so in a way that multiple aspects of the platform work together instead of just one plank. These would just help validate each other and potentially give new insights into human activity. And then, of course, novel approaches or forward-focused R&D. So if there's something that is on an R&D path, something that may be 3 or 5 years out, if it's a bit of a stretch, if our funding can help work towards what would be the future of your technology, we absolutely are interested in that. So these are the timelines for the solicitation, some of the details. So for instance, the awards are going to be up to $500,000. So you are able to submit what you would like out of that grant request, and that can be all the way up to $500,000 or some portion of that. Recipients are required to match TRISH funding with 100% of cost sharing, and so we'll actually go into that a little bit in the Q&A section of how that might be done. But that might be one of the reasons why somebody would apply for less than $500,000 in funding. So this is in the industry program. We do require that a US-based person representing the company apply. The company does have to have a US-based office and a representative. And our schedule is, the solicitation is open. It opened on March 11th, and it is closing on June 26th. So we still have a good month and almost 2 months here of time for folks to do solicitation submissions. We will have another industry webinar in June, so there will be another opportunity for folks to ask questions. And we then will do a review in July and August. We will select and announce in September, and we hope that the work will begin in October. That is the general plan. If there are any questions that need to be done outside of an open forum like this, you certainly can contact us through spacehealth-info@bcm.edu. So some of the reasons why a company would want to work with TRISH. So obviously the very first example of why TRISH funding is useful is that it's non-dilutive capital. This is a grant that will be for a year's worth of work, and so our expectation is that there will be a write-up out of that grant, and that will be the result. And then from there we will look towards next steps. We do believe this allows access to a larger funding community. So there will be folks that are participating in the industry program from different companies and different aspects, including investors. And when we fund something, some of our alumni ask for our help in connecting with some of these participants. And so what I try to actively do is to help the things that we fund find folks that can help them, either for follow-on funding or for future activities, potentially in other agencies. And so, we try to work those that work to help those that work with us. So providing subject matter experts and NASA personnel. So if there are aspects of your technology that need feedback from a user, we can give our knowledge of what has been done in the area, and we can potentially access some of the NASA staff that may also be interested in working with Trish-funded investigators and potentially some of the other expertise that's within the Trish network. So some of the academic groups that we work with, since Trish is a consortium that is a partnership between Baylor College of Medicine, Caltech, and MIT. So there are rich pools of expertise that also could be of interest to a Trish PI. So encouraging risk and development, research and development risks. So we expect you to take some risk, and we've gotten feedback from some of the folks that we funded, the companies that we funded, that our funding allowed them to do things that traditional investors, be they angels or venture capitalists, would discourage, and so that gave them a chance to potentially work on things that had either different markets or broader markets, and we would obviously encourage that as long as that overlaps with the NASA need or the either flight surgeon or astronaut need. And retaining the intellectual property with the PI. So again, NASA's not looking to own PI extensively. I think they do have access to software and technologies that are developed for space use, and they will work with the company in order to understand what those limitations are, but those are in line with what you would expect out of the NIH and the NSF as well. So there are clear guidelines on what the government would like to do, and they are not hoarding intellectual property. They want you to work well with your intellectual property, bring it to market, and then they want to use it. So supporting technology optimization and validation. So this is where we can help you see the differences between what your technology would need to do on the US market and what it would do in space. So this includes what would need to be constraints such as mass or power or volume, also things that might involve some of the validation process that NASA has, such as radiation shielding for the components, or some of the use limitations for things like crew education and time. These are things that may not have been on a developmental pathway because they're not necessarily what you expect a user in North America to consider, but we can give that feedback, and that can be a part of the design for the alteration into space use. And then providing a path for product validation. So this is where Trish has programs for moving things into validation systems. And so, as a company is awarded, we would then work with them on how that gets potentially taken over by NASA. The goal of Trish is something of a springboard. So while our funding is expected to advance a technology's path to market or a knowledge's path to market, at some point our goal is for that to translate into NASA and to be used by NASA with their budgets and their experts. So we work to do that as much as possible, depending upon the project. So whether NASA wants that or not. Providing a path to future government opportunities. So again, I know when we review projects, we take into account when other government agencies are funding those projects, and other government agencies obviously see when we've funded projects. So it's part of that validation process. It just adds credibility to other investors and to government as well. So we believe that Trish-funded projects also get good visibility in the science communities, as well as ideally in other fundraising circles, and we encourage that visibility. So we have a communications lead that will work with PIs, and when you have success getting visibility, we would like to amplify that success. And if there's any way that we can work with any of our efforts for visibility and include some of the examples of our PIs, we certainly like to do that as well. And we always get approval from the participants that they agree that that this is a good opportunity. So we look to try to advance that visibility as much as possible. And so, to that end, our success is aligned with your success. So we want you to be successful. We do have regular check-ins, monthly check-ins with the PIs for all of the TRISH projects, and we have something like 80 in flight right now. And so a TRISH-funded investigator would be a part of the industry team, and we would have monthly check-ins to just understand if you've run into any challenges, if there's anything we can do to help, if there are any unexpected positive or negative situations, we can provide either expertise or guidance or support. And so we look at this as a partnership. So some of the frequently asked questions that we thought some of you would ask. And so just to kind of jump into that frame of mind, some of the things that we expect you to ask. So when will the funding decisions regarding a proposals be made? Again, we are doing an external review led by INRES, and that will be in July and August, with a selection announced in September. And that can be the beginning, middle, or end of September, but it will be by the end of September. And so you can expect a final announcement at that time. Can non-US companies apply to this opportunity? So the solicitation is open to US-based companies. Again, this is very consistent with other federal funding. And there is a link here that explains to some extent the additional information regarding international participation. So there are PIs that work with US-based PIs as co-PIs, and so there are opportunities, but they do involve funding a US-based participant as lead. So what is the TRISH policy for industry cost sharing? And so this is an aspect that I believe would be of considerable interest. The cost sharing for TRISH is expected to be 100%. That means that if you submit for $250,000 of funding, then we expect you to match $250,000 as well in cost sharing. And these are some of the examples. So while that contribution can either be external cash or it can be in kind, so non-cash contributions, and that includes third parties. It can include things like salaries and benefits that are committed, that the company is still paying, but in essence, that person is working on this project 100%. There's also value of additional percent effort contributed by different PIs. So if there's somebody that's contributing their time, that counts. Equipment that would be purchased and needed. So if there's equipment that is being used by a company in order to either do technology builds or validation, then that can be understood at a market rate. There are things like supplies, travel, indirect costs. There is considerable there in ways that can be considered in kind, and so we ask that you put that in your budget as part of your submission and put your best foot forward. So we do expect this to be a competitive process, and we do expect some very good companies and technologies to be applying, and so we encourage folks to work to win. On the next question, can I request an extension for submitting my application? And so, we include this because we do actually usually get a couple of requests right at the deadline. So this would be something that would come in on June 25th saying, I need more time to finish my application. We put this here because there are a number of applicants that get in on time, and our window is open for something like 3 months. So there's a considerable open amount of time. We're having this discussion a good month and a half before the end of the window, and we're having another webinar again in June. There is time here for anyone to submit, and the application process isn't an excruciatingly lengthy one as well. So we are going to expect everyone to fit within the window, and so there will not be extensions, and we encourage everyone to just start earlier. But I think when you go through the submission process, you'll see that it isn't onerous. It is an attempt to understand the best information available, but it is not something that would take a month to write. So is there a required format for biographical sketches? There are templates available from the NIH and the NSF, but there is no required format. So again, you want to put your expertise forward in a way that allows our reviewers to understand what makes your expertise applicable to this project. And keep in mind that when you're submitting, we do have an external review process. There will be experts that are volunteering of their time in order to give their opinion back to Trish as to what would be the absolute best awardees. And so when you put your bio sketch forward, you're trying to show why you have the expertise in order to execute the proposal. And the reviewers will be looking into, does this person have or do this team have the required skills in order to do what they say they're going to do. And regardless of the format used, please take careful note of the 2-page limit. There are some very gifted people that have something like 15-page CVs, and so we understand that, but we need people to stay within a manageable amount of information. I cannot find the answers to my question in the solicitation documents or the guidebook or the FAQ. We have our email address listed here and at the beginning of the presentation and at the end. This is a general email into spacehealth-info@bcm.edu. This is where any kind of inquiry can come into Trish. If you just highlight that it in the title, the industry program, then we know that this can go and get routed very quickly, and we will be very responsive. I think our turnaround is something within a couple of days. And so we do encourage you to look at the solicitation documents, to look through the FAQs that are posted. And if there is something that doesn't apply to those, then reach out to us and we'll give you our best answer. Can I use the Life Sciences Data Architecture, or LSDA, or Lifetime Surveillance of Astronaut Health, LSAH, to obtain and use data for biological samples? And so this question is for anybody that thinks that they're going to apply their technology to astronauts and access the astronaut information in order to help their product development. And this is obviously a very common thing for technology development and healthcare, and applying that to the populations that are impacted, patients in essence. LSDA and LSAH are accessible to Trish PIs. There are considerable approvals that are needed in order to access that information, and the timeline for those approvals are very long. So it is very difficult to include LSDA and LSAH information in a one-year proposal worth of work. If you wait something like 6 to 9 months for approval, that may not give you enough time in order to actually do the development that you need to do around it. So we just list this as a caution. Sometimes people put things like this in there to say that their work is going to be very, very applicable to space health. We encourage the work, just not a reliance on a process that has a tremendous amount of protection, and for good reason, because the astronaut data is obviously very important to the astronaut corps and the flight surgeons. So I just caution about somebody putting something like that in there as an attempt to highlight that they're really focusing on the right audience, because that also may mean that it's a very difficult thing to accomplish within the timeline that the funding will allow. Do I need to be registered in the system for award management before submitting my proposal? So SAM registration for this industry submission is not required, but it is encouraged. And again, the system for award management, or SAM, is for all government funding. So this is the type of thing that if you're on this call and you're interested in Trish funding, this actually may be something that's useful for going after other grants as well. If selected, you will need to be registered in SAM to receive the award. So if you're selected in September and it takes a couple of months to get into SAM, then by waiting until September, you wouldn't be able to actually start work until something like November. If you do the SAM registration earlier, then it just allows you to move faster. But we do understand that you may want to hear that you've actually won the award before you apply, but there's also no downside to getting in the SAM system. So again, if you have any other questions about SAM registration, certainly reach out to us at spacehealth-info, but we encourage SAM submission. So I've kind of spoken about quite a few things, and so we wanted to allow a considerable amount of time for Q&A. We do have myself as well as the Trish team. If there's something that I can't answer, I may go ahead and direct the question to the email system so that we actually have a little bit of time to get back to you in a different format. But I'll go ahead and start to take some questions from this list. So I have a question here that says, thank you for hosting this webinar. I have in mind applicable technologies for the next generation of spacesuits. At one side, looking to improve space radiation by combining nano coatings, 3D printing and advanced smart textiles at the other, and improve emotional well-being for long-term missions. So yes, this is where having an open call means a lot of things are going to apply to cognitive performance. And so things that involve EVAs on first glance typically wouldn't be something that we would think would apply specifically to performance of cognitive decrements. But an argument could be made that emotional well-being is a very big catch-all. I can't necessarily say whether this is specifically applicable to the call at hand. I would ask you to ask yourself that question, and there is a difference between what's on the vehicle and what's on the systems that the astronauts would interact with, and we certainly do want to embed some of the ways to diagnose and potentially provide countermeasures. So we are open to the concept of EVAs, but this one is, I understand why you asked the question, and I would encourage you to apply, but I think that's a general blanket statement to say I would encourage things that are nebulous to apply. And this is something that I think applies to long-term missions and to emotional well-being. But I don't know enough about what you've put in the question to be definitive, and I think in this forum I can't necessarily be definitive. So I would encourage you to consider more details and to submit. Hi, how academic institutions, not-for-profits, can participate in this program. So the academic efforts at Trish do have a couple of mechanisms. So there will be a BRASH solicitation that's open in the fall, and that is focused on academics. And this particular solicitation is focused on companies. So an academic institution can work with a company as a co-PI or a sub, but the submission has to come from the company. It's still possible either as a consultant or as a co-PI for an academic institution to participate, but there are probably better paths that I would encourage to keep an eye out for future Trish activities, because we certainly want to capture academic institutions and their participation. And there just may be a better fit as far as a mechanism that might look into, take into account kind of more experimental aspects or even knowledge. You say more about how high-risk projects are valued, given that Trish is also not a mechanism meant for the pilot exploratory stage. So high-risk projects, I mean, high risk, we've now identified maybe 3 or 4 different ways that high risk is a general term that can apply to research and development. So on the high-risk aspect of our review process, we encourage our reviewers to consider that Trish is focused on forward-thinking research and development and on technologies that are maybe years out. And so we encourage projects that may have high risk, high reward. They still need to be defined with rigor, and they still need to be defined in a well thought out path to execution. And so we still look for good details such as the right team and the right milestones and the right aims, but we also understand that there's an experimental aspect of this, and we encourage that. And so that is part of our review process. It's part of our programmatic relevance review internally, how we will understand whether a submission meets the needs of space health or whether it will in the future, if there is something that applies to Earth healthcare and how that may be carried over into space health workflows that may not be readily available to the applicant. We take those into account. And so for high risk, we just mean experimental and forward thinking, with maybe even the potential for unexpected or new approaches, which we highly encourage. How many grants will be awarded? So we are awarding up to $1.5 million, which means there can be anywhere between 3 awards and some amount of smaller awards. There is the possibility for more, assuming there is strong quality. But right now, our expectation is 1.5 million in awards, which can be somewhere around 3 or more awards, depending upon the quality that is submitted. So, as a company that is in the development phase of a technology eligible for this program, even before having a prototype? That's a really good question. We encourage things in the developmental phase. It would be ideal for a prototype to be in hand, and we encourage that just because we expect that our funding can help a prototype mature. I would go ahead and encourage an application, even if something is close to prototype, simply because we expect over the year there to be considerable maturation with support. And so I would encourage to go ahead and take a little bit of a risk and apply if it's close to prototype. If it's early stage concept and it has very high upside, then it would still be kind of interesting to us. It's just getting further and further away from the ability for us to translate that into NASA in the next year or two, which is kind of our goal. So in that instance, if you have something that's further from prototype, you may want to wait until next year, or you may want to wait until our Catalyst program, which is after our solicitation. So that is another thing I can speak to, which is we have an open call, which is for both academics and companies that will start seriously receiving applications for after these solicitations close. And so that would be in essence July or August. In those periods of time, we'll be looking for things that may not have applied to the open solicitations, or things that are slightly different, but are still applicable to space health. And we absolutely want to hear about those instances. So if there's work that is done outside of behavioral health or cognitive performance, that would be the appropriate mechanism. If something is not quite yet mature enough to be competitive in this call, then the Catalyst program may be another way to still work with Trish outside of this particular solicitation. So the next part of this presentation, we're going to go into how you stay involved with Trish, even if you're not applying on this round. And so there would be other avenues, and we just encourage you to keep working and to access our mechanism that you feel is the absolute best to help your technology. I'm sorry, WebEx is a little difficult here for me to keep track of some of these. You have any preference towards addressing specific types of behavioral performance or cognitive issues? So preference, I wouldn't say at this stage, since we have no idea what the field will look like, we are doing an open call specifically to keep an open mind. I would keep in mind, the two areas of technology development, depth and breadth. When you're dealing with astronauts, you're looking at a small n, and so you're looking at things that can have a deep impact, even if on an individual basis. And so we are looking for the best technologies that can help an astronaut in what is expected to be a manned mission to Mars, something like 15 years from now, expected launch in 2033. And so the preferences would be around what we think the makeup of the crew is going to look like and what we think the mission is going to look like. And to that extent, a lot of this information is publicly available. And so we would just encourage you to put yourself in the user's mindset and to make an argument for the technology that is most applicable for things like crew impact, crew time, again, mass, power, volume, and then also let us know how that would impact North American healthcare. So part of this whole goal is, again, some aspect of economic development and some aspect of improvement of healthcare in North America. And so we hope these submissions also highlight a path to market and help us to understand how this funding advances healthcare in North America. I wouldn't specifically outline individual areas of behavioral health. We have the list of things that we find interesting, but again, we did an open call specifically to allow for things that may be outside of that and for those not to be scored differently or to be de-emphasized. We absolutely encourage and love to be surprised, actually. Pronomics detects epigenetic signals of stress, behavior, aging, and other factors. We are not U.S., but with U.S. connections. If a U.S. partner was the applicant, would the research be required to be based on U.S. soil? I believe the requirement is that it has an office on U.S. soil or a partner on U.S. soil. I believe work can be done outside of the United States as long as it's directed by or tied into a PI that is on U.S. soil. And there are aspects of that are detailed in the link that I provided on the previous FAQ. And if this didn't answer your question, I encourage you to email in through spacehealth-info. It is really clear and it is spelled out. And if this isn't readily available and you can't find that detailed in the solicitation documents on the grant management system we have for submission, then email us and we'll send you that specific detail. What involvement is there among Baylor, Caltech, and MIT in the review process and/or support for the execution of an awarded project? Great question. And so we have an initial process which does kind of a screen to say if we have a number of submissions that maybe were out of scope or in some way questionable. Sometimes you get a variety of submissions that either lack merit or lack focus. And so we will do an initial screen that will involve our participants, staff from not only the science office here at Baylor College of Medicine that is within the TRISH staff, but also our representatives at Caltech and MIT, which are innovation specialists that represent both of those campuses. And from there, we will have a defined number of submissions that will go to external review. And that external review is outside of TRISH involvement. We will have a PRA from NRES that will be, in essence, overseeing the process. And we will then get the recommendation from the participants and we'll see how that recommendation ties in with our programmatic relevance, which we'll do next. And so when the technical review is done externally, then we will do an internal programmatic relevance, which will involve the Caltech and MIT participants in greater detail. At that point, we will be reviewing the perspective and I'm blanking on the word, but the recommendation from the external review, and then we'll be prioritizing into the final awardees. And then that recommendation goes to our director, and our director makes the final decision. We greatly value our partners at Caltech and MIT. They are instrumental in understanding spaces that are or areas of interest that are still in development, and so their expertise is very much involved most deeply in the programmatic relevance.
Hi, James. This is Kristen. Well, I'm these questions. And I think maybe we could probably cover a lot of these questions if we just go back and revisit some of the policies that we have about international affiliations or how they can be connected. So maybe if you could just speak a little bit more in terms of general policy about how Trish interacts with international and U.S. companies based versus international companies based. If you can maybe just expand on that a little bit more, I think that would address several of these questions.
So that you're seeing several of the questions that are involving an industry component. I mean,
Right.
An international component to
right. So
submissions. Okay.
U.S. based, foreign based, or if they're U.S. based but have foreign footprints and they have some of those and team members that would be a part of the grant, how would you envision that being compliant with the Trish guidelines?
And I can kind of reaffirm what I've said before. I think in greater detail we may need to respond offline, but in general we expect the submission to come from a U.S.-based submitter that is at least a branch, if not the headquarters of a company. An international component can tie into the submitter as either a consultant or as a co-PI or sub-PI, but the submission needs to come from a U.S.-based representative of the company per our policy and I believe per federal acquisition regulations. Is there a part of this that you would like to expand on, or is there a part of this that we should reference to the documents that are uploaded into GRID?
We can certainly do that. And as just a reminder to these questions that we have in the Q&A, the ones that we don't get to live during this discussion, all of these will be up in our FAQs on the website. So if we don't get to your question, or if we need a little bit of time digging in to make sure that we're giving you the right answer, they will all be addressed in time.
Yeah, thank you. It's especially helpful if there are several questions in the same area. I'm working through the kind of feed here and trying to kind of go as I see them, but I may be missing something. So if I've missed anything, I certainly encourage something by email as a follow-on. I'll go through some more of these. Can you talk a bit more about the path to full integration with the Mars project? Following award and delivery of a successful project, what are the most likely next steps for collaborating with Trish NASA in the future? And that is a great question, actually. We have our funding mechanism for over the year of work, or in the brash environment, sometimes a 2 years worth of work. The radiation potentially is up to 3 years worth of work. So there is the possibility that Trish could engage in further work past this area, but we really encourage this translation into NASA. And right now there are different aspects of the NASA team and a group that are working on the exploration aspect. And so one of our closest partners out of the Human Research Program is the Exploration Medical Capabilities Group, which are looking into how the different tools available to both the astronauts and the flight surgeon in the future will be understood, accessed, resourced. And so they have a process, and we work with them to understand how our deliverables can translate into their toolkit, so to speak. And then there's other different elements that are across NASA's Johnson Space Center and other parts of NASA. We engage those different elements when there are champions that would like to take a technology forward, and so then we try to work with that group in order to get through whatever steps would be appropriate in their area. We know that this is a considerable distance away from the Mars mission, but we are one of the groups specifically focused in this area and are working very hard to get a good set of tools available and to help those tools mature over the next period of time and into NASA use. And the NASA acceptance process is a long one with good reason. There's zero margin of error. And so we want to encourage the absolute best technologies to get into that process and support it along the way. So therefore, we actually continue to support even our alumni, both the PIs that are working on knowledge or the PIs that are working on technology or the companies that are working on technologies. Even past our funding, we encourage their visibility and we work on those outputs to get into the appropriate decision makers at NASA. It is still up to NASA, of course, to prioritize, to care for and prioritize what are our outputs, and so we're still working on that aspect. So if industry needs an academic partner for developing some specific science research, taking technology from TRL to higher, how could this partner be found before the submission in order to correctly budget all the investment need? And so, this is maybe even something that applies to that international discussion. If you need a partner, now would be the time to try to find somebody that would advance your particular need and also you would work well with. We actually can't help with matchmaking because we have no idea who might be applying and what they might need. So we just encourage, if you feel that there is an academic component on either research or validation, to either work within your network or to look for a good partner. And sometimes that may be international, but this is why we've left open the window as long as we could in order to give enough time for you to find a partner. And for those academic partners, keep in mind that they have to get approval from their research governance groups. And so sometimes it takes a number of weeks in order to get something defined and approved through an academic center. And we would just encourage that over the next 2 months. If a professor has some of his own startup funding, non-federal, and is acting as a co-I with a company, can he use his startup fund towards in-kind matching funds for the proposal? I believe so. I think the in-kind matching funds or support can come from a number of third parties, and a company that has support from an academic center or from funding that is external simply just helps advance that project in ways that amplify Trish's funding. So I would encourage that. I think any funding that can be brought in from state, local, federal, other investors, academic groups, all of that would be worthwhile. And especially if it's something you have control over, I think that is a plus. We are a small business with a multinational research group, but limited resources for meeting cost sharing requirements. NASA does not allow payments to non-US participants, but can we count their salaries towards cost matching requirements? Salaries and benefits was one of the things that was listed as in-kind potential areas for cost sharing. So on its surface, I believe, yes, even if those participants are not in the United States, as long as the submission comes from a US-based branch. So I would believe that would be correct based off of just a very cursory review of the question. But I would reference back to the materials that are in the solicitation for more depth if that doesn't answer the question. If the underlying tech platform is working and a product, but it could be used for non-invasive monitoring, but never made for that form factor, would that be too far a stretch for this stage of Trish funding? So if I'm kind of parsing this apart, you have a tech platform for non-invasive monitoring, but it was made for another purpose, and you think that it would apply to the unique use case of astronauts in space. Yes, I would encourage, if you think it applies to the use case and you have something that you believe is working, that seems like that would be exactly in line with the general call for things that would apply for space health. Even if it wasn't initially designed that way, if you put in your proposal what the funding will do in order to help that technology be applicable to space health, and that I think helps strengthen your proposal and makes it more credible. If the idea submitted would have IP application on Earth, what safety measures does the process have in place to protect the company's IP? And so, There is an IP discussion, and that is usually if you've already done IP and have already submitted it before our funding, then our funding simply helps maybe validate a technology or potentially adjust it for space health, but it may not change the underlying IP. If you have completely new IP, then you'll submit that IP during the course of the year or shortly thereafter. You'll notify Trish, and then the normal application of intellectual property from federal funding is applicable. I believe they do want to retain the use of things that were developed with federal funds for the space health needs or use, for specifically, how that would apply to space. But at the same time, they understand that there is a profit motive. The goal of NASA is eventually to buy things when they're mature. And so you may have an early stage of IP, and then you may create different versions, version 2, version 3, version 4. The specific aspect that was developed with federal funds does have use by the federal government. I think that's also true of NIH grants. But at the same time, it's not onerous, and they do actually encourage you to continue to develop under your own power into new iterations, and those iterations would be entirely yours as well. So I don't know about safety measures, but this is actually a well-worn path, and it is meant to encourage IP development. One of the key requirements for international participants is that most of the research needs to be done in the U.S. This is Emmanuel. Thank you, Emmanuel, for responding. Do we have to submit through Inspire's portal? No, that's actually a great question for us to end on, actually. Actually, this particular submission is not through NRES. This particular submission is through Trish's in-house grant management system. The specific links are available on our website, but you can find it at just spacehealth.bcm.edu with no www. So just spacehealth.bcm.edu. And it's also on our website. So if you just look for Trish, if you just Google Trish or search for Translational Research Institute for Space Health, you'll come up with the Baylor webpage, and that would also have links to our open solicitations and funding. So we're pretty easy to find. We really try to be, but it is not through Inspires. And the solicitation is listed actually in the chat as well. So we are wrapping up on time. I thank you so much, everyone that joined us. I hope this was informative. We really are excited about all of the potential discussions that may involve this aspect of industry or behavioral health or cognitive performance. We encourage you to stay involved with Trish. So we do have this Biomedical Research Advances for Space Health, which is the BRASH I mentioned earlier, and that is more of an academic focusing mechanism. That is usually for 2 years for roughly $400,000 each year. More obviously than what we have available in this. And so topics are being considered now. So if you have an idea out there that you think is applicable to space health and you think this is something that Trish should be looking into, we really encourage you to email us. And we'll also be having some webinars coming up on different things that we're exploring. One example is hibernation and how that medically would be feasible. And so keep an eye out because we've got some really interesting things coming. We also have a postdoc fellowship that's opening in the fall of 2020. And so we have a postdoc program, and we usually take something like 4 postdocs each year, and then bring them on for 2 years, potentially with a third that's renewable. And so we're interested in mentors, and part of what Trish is looking to do is to bring new people to NASA. So if you haven't worked with NASA before and you want to be a mentor, or you think you are a postdoc, keep an eye out for future funding. We're really excited to hear more about what you may bring to the discussion. We're also encouraging the Catalyst program, but just keep in mind that anything that comes into Catalyst can't be applicable to open solicitations. So anything that would go into the Catalyst program has to be clearly outside of the industry program and the industry solicitation. So I would encourage folks to look at that more in August, September than now. We also have our orbit, so please stay involved with our general community, which is www.trish.force.com. And this is not only our funded PIs, but our alumni and our experts and our enthusiasts. And so if we highlight some of our programs, our projects, some of the things that are happening in our orbit, we ideally have new people participate. So please join us. And then for our solicitations and programs, that was a great question about Inspires. So for BRASH and for postdoc, you would apply to the Inspires link on your left. But for this industry program, you would apply to the spacehealth.bcm.edu, which is our grant management system internally. And if you go to the Trish website, you'll be able to actually see access links to our different funded opportunities. And so our webpage is a great place to start. So again, thank you so much for everyone that joined us. And we look forward to hearing from you in the future. If you do have any questions that I didn't get to, or maybe I didn't answer to your satisfaction, I highly encourage you to email the spacehealth-info@bcm.edu, and we'll get back to you. Thank you very much for everyone that participated, including all the Trish team. And we will do this again here in June, and then also look forward for future webinars led by Kristen on some exciting topics.